The grey walls of the room pressed down on him, squeezing his temples with the steel vise. There was a constant monotonous pounding in his head as nails were driven into his consciousness, one after another. Every thought was a nail that was driven into the flesh of the brain, leaving bleeding wounds. He was sitting on the floor, surrounded by emptiness and the echo of his own screams. The world outside the window seemed too bright, too real to be true. Only his pain was real. Every heartbeat reverberated throughout his body, piercing him from the top of his head to the tips of his fingers. No one came. No one heard his pleas. He didn't remember how he got here, but he knew there was no way out. This room of the mental hospital became his prison, his curse. Nails are his only reality. He tried to stand up, but his legs wouldn't obey him. They were pinned to the floor, as was his entire body, part of this room, part of this world of pain. He closed his eyes, trying to remember what the light was like, what the air was like, free from the smell of blood and metal. But all that sounded in my head was a damn pounding. Fragments of memories made their way through the fog of consciousness, faces, voices, laughter. But it all seemed alien, as if from another world. His world is now nails, an endless series of nails that drive into his flesh, leaving lacerations on his skin and in his soul. Time did not exist here. It flowed like a thick, viscous substance, trapping him in its sticky streams. Each new nail is another second, another minute stretched into infinity. He knew it wouldn't stop. Pain became his companion, his only true one. Sometimes it seemed to him that he could hear voices, vague and distant, calling his name. But he had already forgotten his name. I forgot who I was. There were only nails piercing his consciousness, becoming his essence. He looked down at his hands. Metal rods replaced fingers, penetrating flesh and bones. He was no longer human. He was a machine of pain, a creature made of metal and horror. Nails became his life, his breath. He realized that fighting was pointless. Pain is his new reality. He let go of the remnants of resistance, let the nails swallow him whole. The room closed around him, leaving only the sound of a hammer hammering the last nail into his mind. Protocol 12.1 Crime Scene Inspection. The application was received from neighbors, apartment 48, Lyconta Street 4. Complaints about an unpleasant smell. After breaking into the door and entering the apartment, a naked man was found. Later it turned out. Andrei Petrovich Lokosov, 26 years old. The room in which the arrested man was staying was extremely polluted. Multiple streaks of blood on the walls and floors. Bloody clothes, presumably female during the initial examination. During the arrest, Lokosov did not resist, showed apathy, did not answer questions, and did not give any explanations. A decision has been made to conduct an extensive psychiatric examination. A further inspection of apartment 48 without witnesses revealed more eerie details. A hammer and long carpenter's nails were found in the living room next to the detainee. One nail was driven into the wall. The other was lying on the floor, covered in blood and fragments of fabric. The hammer was covered with dried blood, traces of which were everywhere, on the walls, floor, ceiling, as if a storm of unimaginable violence had broken out in this room. Investigators note. A dismembered female body lay in the bathroom, splattered with blood and covered with torn towels. Body fragments were scattered around. The dimness of the room, the musty smell of rotten blood, and the heavy air create an atmosphere of claustrophobia and horror. The apartment seems to be saturated with madness. Papers with indistinct notes, illegible scribbles, and mutilated drawings are scattered on the desk. There is a state of absolute desolation around, as if the concepts of normality and reason had long ceased to exist here. Andrei was tossing and turning in bed, his eyes tightly shut. Unbearable pain enveloped his mind. Pain nested in his temples, tearing his thoughts to pieces, leaving behind only chaos and darkness. He clutched at his head, trying to keep it from exploding, but each gesture brought only a new wave of suffering. There was no salvation, either in wakefulness or in sleep. When the pain exhausted him to the point of exhaustion, and he sank into a shaky state of drowsiness, nightmares came, terrifying and real as death itself. He found himself in another world where strange and disgusting creatures emerged from the darkness. Creatures without eyes, without lips, only naked flesh, empty eye sockets gaping in the void. They stretched out their arms to him, their fingers like hooks clinging to his consciousness, pulling him into the darkness. In his dream, he was wandering in a forest created not from tree trunks, but from limbs, arms and legs, writhing and writhing as if in agony. The ground was squelching underfoot, soaked in blood. The tree arms reached out to him. The whip fingers whipped at his face, wrapped around his neck, strangled him. Andre ran, stumbling and falling, but the forest was endless, and a booming pulse could be heard from its depths. Heart, huge and pulsating, it beat somewhere in the center of this eerie world, filling it with the rhythm of evil. He was running towards that heart, attracted by an invisible force. It was his curse, his calling. He had to find him, see him firsthand, to understand the essence of his suffering. His feet sank into the bloody slush. His face was covered with cold sweat. But he continued to move, driven by horror and inevitability. And so, among the hand trees, he saw him. Heart, huge, twisted and broken, it beat with a bloody pulsation, scattering drops of dark liquid around. It lived and breathed, and with each blow the evil spread, filling the air and penetrating into his lungs. His heart was beating to the beat of his headache, synchronously and violently, intensifying every spasm, every concussion. He wanted to scream, but the sound stuck in his throat, and only a soundless exhale escaped his lips. My heart came alive. Vessels and arteries grew, entwined his legs, tying him to the ground. Andre felt it throbbing inside his head, tearing his consciousness apart. At that moment, he woke up. A loud, hoarse exhale escaped from his lungs. The room swayed before my eyes, turning into a blurry vortex. The pain did not disappear. She hit her temples again, like a hammer on an anvil. The world around him was falling apart, and he didn't know where reality was and where the nightmare was. He sat up in bed with his head in his hands. The walls were squeezing him, getting closer, getting unbearably close. Andre knew that it wasn't just pain. It was a punishment for what he saw in his dreams. The heart of evil continued to beat inside him, and every contraction of it responded with a wave of pain that covered his head. He didn't know how long it had been since it all started. The days and nights merged into one, turning into an endless series of torments. His heart was throbbing. The pain was covering him with a black wave, and he could no longer understand whether he was alive or his soul had long ago absorbed evil. Everything around him became deaf, as if he was surrounded by walls of steel and flesh soaked in blood. He lay down again, closing his eyes. The pain was unbearable, but he knew that this forest was waiting for him. The toothless creatures, the elders, and the old women, they were still there, whispering to him about the evil he had become. They called him back into the darkness, to where his heart was waiting to swallow him back into its abyss. Day after day, they merged into one incessant stream of pain and fear. Andre existed without living. The headache became his constant companion, like a shadow that cannot be removed. Every day it only intensified, turning into a continuous rhythm, subjugating every thought, every gesture. He avoided sleep, knowing that every time he would be waiting for this cursed forest inhabited by toothless creatures and a pulsating heart of evil. I slept fitfully, waking up in a cold sweat with nails ringing in my head. The pain was everywhere, penetrating his consciousness through and through, leaving not a single corner for salvation. Time has lost its meaning. Morning followed day, day followed night, and he was still crouched in the corner of the room. Sometimes he tried to go outside, but the world outside seemed alien and hostile. The loud sounds of cars, people's voices, everything was too real, too vivid, like an alien reality to which he no longer belonged. Andre tried to find relief in alcohol, but whiskey only temporarily dulled the sharpness of sensations. The pain did not let go, only slowed down, becoming dull and viscous, like a rubber ball squeezing his head from the inside. He smoked one cigarette after another, hoping that at least the smoke would fill this void, fill this hole from which evil oozes. One night, dank and cold, he stood on the balcony, leaning on the railing. The city below was living its own life, pulsing with lights, alien and distant. He finished the last sip of whiskey, feeling a warm wave of alcohol roll down his throat, leaving behind a slight burning sensation. The cigarette smoldered slowly in his fingers, and he looked at it as if he did not understand what it was, and why. And suddenly, his gaze fell on the floor. There, among the debris and ashes, lay a hammer and two long nails. They appeared there as if by magic, as if they had always been there, and he had just noticed them. My heart stopped for a moment, and then began to pound wildly in my chest. The nails were long, sharp, and had a metallic sheen. Their points reached out to him, alluring and frightening. He lifted the hammer, feeling its weight in his hand. The cold metal gave off a pleasant tingling sensation in his palm. Andre didn't know how or why, but he knew what he had to do. He knew that these nails were the key to his release, or to his final fall into the abyss. Two nails are like two paths, two ends, two solutions. He picked up one of them, looking at how the dim light of the lantern reflected on the metal surface. The nail was sharp, as if it could pierce through the very essence of his pain, reach to the very depths. He set it on the concrete parapet, looked at the hammer. It seemed that his whole life, all his pain, all the horror of the last weeks were concentrated in this moment. Andre didn't know why he needed it, but he understood that this act was the only way to end this nightmare, once and for all. He raised the hammer, feeling a hand raise it over his head. His heart was beating fast, booming, and the nails in his head were pounding in time with his breathing. He took a deep breath, feeling the cold night air fill his lungs, and raised the hammer to strike. Protocol 12.3 Psychiatric and Medical Examination. Patient Andrei Petrovich Lokosov, 26 years old. The examination was conducted by Dr. Kovalev AI, Dr. Samoilova EV. Andrei Petrovich Lokosov was taken for examination in a state of deep apathy. Outwardly, he is extremely emaciated. His face is pale, covered with dried blood and abrasions. The lack of hygiene is clearly marked. The hair is stuck together. The body is stained with unidentified spots. There is a frozen expression of detachment on his face. His gaze is empty, unfocused, as if he is looking through people and objects. The patient does not make contact, does not respond to questions, does not show any emotions. When trying to ask him a direct question or address him, he remains silent, sometimes quiet. Muttering is heard, incoherent and meaningless. During the first examination, the whispering of unintelligible phrases was recorded, in which the words nails, heart, evil are caught. The speech has no clear context. The intonation is monotonous, quiet. Lokosov is clearly in a state of deep psychopathology. There are signs of severe psychosis with vivid elements of depersonalization. The patient seems disconnected from reality, completely immersed in his inner world. Facial expressions are constrained, movements are slow and clumsy. In rare moments of activation, it can suddenly turn to abrupt, meaningless actions, as if reacting to internal stimuli. There are signs of sensory hallucinations. Lokosov often listens to something invisible, turns his head as if he hears non-existent sounds. Cases of whispering and repetition of the same words have been recorded. The content of his delusional ideas is probably related to painful experiences centered around pain, self-torture, and some kind of heart of evil. The patient seems to be convinced of the existence of some force or entity controlling him. At the moment, the patient does not show aggression. However, based on his condition and act, a high risk of self-destructive behavior or outbreaks of unmotivated violence can be assumed. A complete lack of critical attitude to his actions, delusional ideas, and possible hallucinations make him dangerous to himself and others. Conclusion. Andrei Petrovich Lokosov shows signs of severe psychotic disorder with deep depersonalization and a clear loss of connection with reality. The current mental status is extremely unstable, with high security risks. Immediate hospitalization to a specialized psychiatric institution of a closed type is recommended for complete diagnosis and isolation in order to prevent possible acts of violence. Andrei stood on the balcony, shivering from a mixture of cold and what he was about to do. The nail in his hand felt warm, as if it were a part of him, an extension of the pain that was tearing him apart from the inside. The hammer seemed somehow unreal, like a child's toy, but its weight was real. His muscles tensed, and he knew what was going to happen. With a strength and determination that he had not known in himself before, he put the point of the nail to his forehead. But he stopped feeling normal a long time ago. Nails and hammers became his reality, and he knew that he needed to drive this curse right into his brain in order to perhaps finally find peace. He raised the hammer over his head and, without giving himself time to think, struck. The blow was precise, sharp. The metal pierced the skin, the skull, and entered the brain. The world exploded with bright light, and the pain became unbearable for a moment. He screamed, but the scream faded into the night. Then there was silence, sudden and deep, like a black hole. And suddenly, the pain receded. From somewhere in the depths of his mind came a strange feeling of relief, as if something inside him had broken, given way under the weight of a nail. Andrei exhaled slowly, expecting that he was about to die, that his consciousness would go out like a burned-out light bulb. But death did not come. The world was still there. The balcony, the city, winter, the cold night. He was alive. A feeling of wild relief, even joy, spread in my chest. He looked down and saw a thin trickle of blood running down his forehead, dripping onto the concrete. It should have scared him, but it didn't. On the contrary, he felt that he had done something right, that this act of violence against himself had brought him unprecedented liberation. But it wasn't enough. One nail is just the beginning. He picked up the second nail and, without hesitation, put it next to the first one. The hammer was in his hand again, heavy and sure. The second blow was accurate, as was the first. The nail went deep, as if piercing through his skull. And then everything changed. The world around him trembled, turned around and split into pieces. What he had seen before, ordinary city lights, neighboring houses, suddenly became unnaturally bright, like naked nerves. They vibrated, shimmered with dirty colors, as if the world was just a fragile film covering something more terrible. He saw the truth. The nails driven into his head revealed to him what was hidden behind this illusory veil. He saw the shadows in the night come to life, reaching out to him with their long, bony fingers. I saw how the city was covered with a thin network of cobwebs in which creatures were moving, making soundless screams. The houses were alive, moving and breathing, their walls pulsing like flesh. It was monstrous and wonderful at the same time. It was as if he had torn apart reality and looked inside its dark, rotting depths. Everything became strangely clear, as if the nails in his head had replaced the pain, and replaced it with a new understanding. He saw the true face of the world, its creepy, twisted face, and he couldn't look away. The guy staggered, stepped back, barely keeping his balance. The pain that tore through his days and nights receded, giving way to something deeper and more frightening. Now he knew that his torment was just a preparation for this moment, for this vision. He stood on the balcony, looking at the distorted picture of the world. The nails in his head throbbed in time with the beating of his heart. Andrei knew that there was no turning back anymore. He had become a part of this nightmare, a part of the very heart of evil that was now beating in his chest. Medical examination protocol. During the initial examination, abnormal formations were noticed in the forehead and temples. The X-ray examination revealed the presence of 2 metal objects embedded in the skull, presumably nails. The nails are located in the area of the frontal lobes. One of them runs along the left frontal bone. The other is closer to the temporal bone. The metal objects entered at an angle, and their location indicates self-inflicted wounds. The extraction of nails was performed in emergency surgery under local anesthesia due to the unstable condition of the patient. The procedure began with a careful incision of the tissues to get to the nails and minimize additional damage. During the extraction of the first nail, the patient suddenly began to scream despite anesthesia, showing signs of acute pain shock. The sounds made by Lokosov were more like a howl, reflecting unbearable inner horror and suffering. Immediately after removing the second nail, the patient fell into a state of severe pain shock. His eyes opened wide, the pupils dilated to their maximum, and his face was distorted by a grimace of unspeakable horror. He began to thrash around on the operating table, shouting incoherent words. The sedatives used had no effect. The patient remained in a state of agony, soon passing into a non-contact state. After removing the nails, Lokosov continues to show signs of acute pain syndrome. The pain is clearly not physical, but psychogenic in nature, but its strength is so great that the patient is in a borderline state between consciousness and fainting. Attempts at verbal contact with the patient remain unsuccessful. Doctors record a state of extreme mental and physical exhaustion, accompanied by a constant piercing scream, as if pain permeates every corner of his consciousness. Conclusion. Andrei Petrovich Lokosov is in critical condition after removing 2 nails from his skull. The patient went into pain shock, which indicates possible damage to the pain centers of the brain or a deep psychogenic effect from the loss of foreign bodies. Immediate hospitalization to the intensive care unit with round-the-clock supervision and subsequent psychiatric consultations are recommended to evaluate further treatment. Andrei stood on the balcony, still stunned by the truth revealed to him. His brain throbbed under the weight of the nails, but the pain was no longer the overwhelming one that tore him apart. The world around us has acquired a different look. Distorted, creepy, true. He could see the darkness hiding behind the facades of the houses, as invisible entities gliding through the air, devouring the light. And then the doorbell rang. A sharp, irritating sound made him flinch. Andrei, still swaying slightly, headed for the front door, the hammer still clutched in his hand. He didn't know who it might be, and he hardly cared right now. He was in another dimension where the doorbells meant nothing. But she was behind the door. His girlfriend, the one who was always there for him, even when he was losing control of himself. She practiced the occult, a hobby that he had once considered strange but harmless. Her apartment was full of books about ancient rituals, strange artifacts, and candles that never went out. Her cold fingers were always soaked in the scent of herbs and wax. She stood in the doorway, looking at him with slight concern. Her eyes glittered in the dark, big, deep, like black lakes. Andrei looked at her, but now, with nails in his head, he saw her differently. He noticed a glint of something predatory in her eyes, as if something alien and dangerous was hiding under the mask of a familiar face. "Are you okay?" Her voice was soft, but there was a strange note in it. She stepped inside, and for a moment it seemed to him that her face was distorted, stretched out, and her skin became pale, almost transparent. The shadow of a smile flickered on her lips, and a strange, viscous smell hung in the air, a mixture of sweet and rotten. He stepped back. The hammer slipped out of his hand and thudded to the floor. A look of horror appeared in his eyes. She took a step towards him, and with each step she took, he felt his strength leaving him. Her eyes were fixed on him, bright and hungry. It seemed to Andrei that sharp fangs were sticking out of the girl's mouth, ready to sink into his neck. Andrei tried to speak, but the words stuck in his throat. He couldn't take his eyes off her face, which now looked like the mask of a vampire hungry for life. Suddenly, it became clear to him that all these days, weeks, months, she had been draining the life force out of him. Slowly, imperceptibly, she was the source of this pain, these nightmares. She stood in front of him with her head tilted to the side, as if studying his reaction. Her lips curled into that strange smile again, and Andre felt his head begin to throb again. The nails in his skull rang as if reacting to her presence. His world had shrunk to this one room, to this one moment. "You look strange." Her voice sounded mocking now. She stepped closer and he felt her breath on his skin. It was as cold as an icy wind. He knew that if she touched him, he would disappear into this night, into this horror. Smiling, he bent down and picked up the hammer from the floor. The investigator's reasoning. I was standing at the window, looking out at the gray sky. This case with Lokosov did not fit into my head. During my career, I have seen many horrors, faced unbearable cruelty, but what I saw in Apartment 48 made even me shudder. It wasn't just another act of violence, it was something more, something that breathed real horror. Nails in the head of Lokosov. This image never left my mind. I saw them being pulled out of his skull, long, covered in blood and something else, like a part of himself. He got them into his head. I couldn't figure out why he was still alive. This guy must have been possessed. But with what? What kind of force made him do such a thing? And the woman, her remains scattered around the apartment like toys in the hands of a child. What did he see in her? A monster. A monster! She was clearly more than just a victim to him. I kept asking myself the same question. Why did you kill her? When I finally asked him, Lokosov looked at me, and I saw a void in his eyes that pierced me to the depths of my soul. He said it, almost in a whisper, but every word he said stuck in my mind like nails in his head. "She didn't have a soul," he said, as if that was the most obvious answer in the world. The heart of evil was beating in her chest. I saw him in a dream. She drank my blood. She tormented me with pain. These words are stuck in my head. What did that mean? Was it just the ravings of a madman? Or was there some truth in them, some sinister truth hidden under the cover of madness? He spoke of her as a being devoid of a soul, the embodiment of evil. Maybe he really believed that he was living with a demon, that she was sucking the life out of him, slowly and inexorably. I thought about Nails again. It wasn't just an act of self-torture. He was trying to lock something inside his head, something that he thought she had put there. His mind has created a prison of pain to keep this horror inside itself. But what if what he said was true? What if she really was feeding on his life like an energy vampire, and he saw it, felt it slowly killing him? Sometimes reality presents such nightmares that the boundaries between psychosis and truth begin to blur. I walked away from the window, feeling a strange, lingering heaviness in my chest. This case haunted me. It wasn't just a brutal murder case. There was something more to it, something that couldn't be explained by logic. Lokosov was left behind, nails and pain, locked in his own hell, where I had no access. And this hell beckoned to me, attracted me, promising to reveal its terrifying secrets if I only dared to look into its abyss. But I was already scared at the very thought of what I might see there.